Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now let's begin. I'm a forensic anthropologist who spent 8 years working at the Southeastern Anthropological Research Facility, also known as the Body Farm, at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. You can call me Dr. Sarah Chen if you want, though most people at the facility just called me the Bone Detective during my time there. I've examined thousands of human remains in every conceivable state of decomposition. Fresh bodies, mummified remains, scattered skeletal fragments, and every stage of decay the human body can undergo in our unique research environment. But what I'm about to tell you about is the one case that made me question everything I thought I knew about forensic science and ultimately led me to leave the field entirely. The Southeastern Anthropological Research Facility is a 3-acre outdoor laboratory where donated human bodies are placed in various environments to study decomposition patterns. It's a critical resource for law enforcement, helping us determine time since death, cause of death, and identify remains in criminal investigations. The facility handles about 100 body donations per year, each carefully documented and monitored throughout the decomposition process. During my time there, I specialized in skeletal analysis, examining bones for signs of trauma, disease, and demographic characteristics like age, sex, and ancestry. I thought I had seen everything the human body could reveal after death, but I was wrong. The case I'm about to describe began on March 8, 2019. When we received an unusual request from Detective Maria Rodriguez of the Knox County Sheriff's Department. She had been investigating a missing person case that had gone cold 3 years earlier, and new evidence had emerged that might be connected to remains found in a remote area of the Great Smoky Mountains. What made this request unusual wasn't the circumstances of the discovery, but rather what happened after we brought the remains back to our laboratory. The missing person was David Michael Thompson, a 34-year-old wilderness photographer who had disappeared while hiking alone in the Smokies in February 2016. David was an experienced outdoorsman who knew the mountains well, but he had failed to return from what was supposed to be a 3-day photography expedition. Search and rescue teams had combed the area for weeks, finding only his abandoned campsite and some scattered camera equipment. No trace of David himself was ever found, and the case had remained unsolved for over 3 years. The breakthrough came when a group of cave explorers discovered what appeared to be human remains in a previously unmapped cave system about 2 miles from David's last known location. The remains were scattered across the cave floor in a pattern that suggested they had been there for several years. Detective Rodriguez contacted our facility because she needed expert analysis to determine if these remains belonged to David Thompson, and if so, what might have happened to him in that cave. I was assigned to lead the examination because of my experience with skeletal remains found in unusual environmental conditions. Caves present unique preservation challenges due to their stable temperatures, high humidity, and limited access to scavenging animals. I had worked on several cave recovery cases before, but nothing had prepared me for what we would discover about these particular remains. The remains arrived at our facility on March 12, 2019, carefully packaged and documented by the recovery team. At first glance, they appeared to be a fairly typical case of skeletal remains that had been exposed to cave conditions for approximately 3 years. The bones showed the expected signs of mineral staining from cave sediments, and the overall preservation was consistent with what I would expect from that environment. But as I began my detailed examination, I started noticing things that didn't make sense. The first unusual finding was the completeness of the skeleton. When human remains are left in natural environments for extended periods, they typically become scattered by animal activity, water movement, or simple gravitational forces. Even in caves, which are relatively protected environments, you would expect to find some bones missing or displaced from their anatomical positions. But this skeleton was remarkably complete, with every major bone present and accounted for. More puzzling still, the bones were arranged in nearly perfect anatomical position, as if the person had simply laid down and never moved again. The second anomaly was the condition of the bones themselves. After 3 years of cave exposure, I would have expected to see significant weathering, mineral deposits, and possibly some degree of structural degradation. Instead, these bones looked almost pristine, showing minimal signs of environmental exposure despite supposedly being in that cave since 2016. The surface preservation was so good that I could clearly observe fine details that should have been obscured or damaged by years of cave conditions. But the most disturbing discovery came when I began examining the bones under magnification for signs of trauma or pathological conditions. Human bones tell stories about how a person lived and died, and I'm trained to read those stories in microscopic detail. What I found on David Thompson's remains challenged everything I understood about bone formation and preservation. Every single bone in the skeleton showed evidence of what appeared to be deliberate modification, not the kind of trauma you might expect from an accident or natural death, but precise, methodical alterations that seemed to serve no biological or pathological purpose. There were tiny drill holes, perfectly circular and uniform in diameter, arranged in geometric patterns across the surface of multiple bones. The holes were so small and precisely placed that they would have required sophisticated tools and considerable skill to create. Even more puzzling were the strange markings etched into the bone surface. These weren't random scratches or natural wear patterns, but deliberate engravings that formed complex geometric designs. The markings were incredibly fine, almost microscopic, and created with a level of precision that would have been nearly impossible to achieve without specialized equipment. They covered nearly every bone in the skeleton, from the skull down to the smallest bones in the hands and feet. I had never seen anything like these modifications in my 8 years of forensic work. They didn't match any known cultural practices, medical procedures, or trauma patterns documented in the anthropological literature. The precision and extent of the modifications suggested they had been created by someone with advanced knowledge of skeletal anatomy and access to sophisticated tools. But the purpose remained completely mysterious. I decided to consult with colleagues at other institutions, sending detailed photographs and measurements to experts in forensic anthropology, archaeology, and medical pathology. Every specialist I contacted was equally baffled by the findings. Dr. William Hayes at the Smithsonian Institution, who has examined skeletal remains from cultures around the world, told me he had never encountered anything similar. Dr. Jennifer Martinez at the FBI's forensic laboratory said the modifications didn't match any known methods of body preparation or ritual treatment in their extensive database. The mystery deepened when I attempted to determine how long the modifications had been present on the bones. Fresh alterations to bone tissue show characteristic microscopic features that change over time as the bone responds to damage and begins healing or deteriorating processes. But the modifications on David's remains showed no signs of recent creation, no evidence of healing response, and no indication of the natural aging process that should have occurred over 3 years. It was as if the modifications had been present for much longer than the 3 years David had been missing, possibly decades or even longer. But that was impossible given that we had positive identification of the remains through dental records and DNA analysis. These were definitely David Thompson's bones, but they had been altered in ways that seemed to predate his disappearance by many years. The implications of this finding were deeply troubling. If the modifications were older than David's disappearance, then someone had been planning whatever happened to him for a very long time. If they were created after his death, then someone with extraordinary skill and equipment had spent considerable time working on his remains in that cave. Neither explanation made sense given the circumstances of his disappearance and discovery. I decided to examine the cave site myself to see if I could find any clues that might explain these impossible modifications. Detective Rodriguez arranged for me to accompany a second recovery team to the location where David's remains had been discovered. The cave system was located in a particularly remote section of the Smokies, accessible only by a challenging 3-mile hike through dense forest and rocky terrain. When we reached the cave entrance, I immediately understood why it had taken 3 years for anyone to discover David's remains. The opening was partially concealed by fallen rocks and thick vegetation, making it nearly invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. The cave explorers who had found the remains told me they had only discovered the entrance by accident while searching for a different cave system entirely. Inside the cave, the recovery site was even more puzzling than the remains themselves. The area where David's skeleton had been found was a natural chamber about 20 feet wide and 15 feet high, with relatively flat, sandy floor. But what struck me immediately was how clean and undisturbed the entire space appeared. After 3 years, I would have expected to see animal tracks, debris from weather events, or at least some accumulation of natural sediments. Instead, the chamber looked almost sterile, as if it had been carefully maintained throughout the entire period. The recovery team had marked the exact position where each bone had been found, and I spent several hours examining these locations with my portable equipment. What I discovered only deepened the mystery surrounding David's case. The sand beneath where his skeleton had been positioned showed no signs of natural decomposition processes. When a body decomposes in any environment, it leaves characteristic chemical traces in the surrounding soil or sediment. These traces can persist for years and provide valuable information about the decomposition timeline and environmental conditions. But the sand samples I collected from beneath David's remains showed no evidence that a body had ever decomposed in that location. The chemical composition was consistent with natural cave sediments that had never been exposed to human remains. It was as if David's skeleton had been carefully placed in that chamber after all soft tissue decomposition had occurred elsewhere, then positioned to look like a natural death scene. Even more disturbing was what I found when I examined the cave walls surrounding the recovery site. Using high-powered LED lights, I could see that the rock surfaces were covered with the same type of geometric markings that had been etched into David's bones. The cave wall engravings were larger and more elaborate than the bone modifications, but they shared the same precise methodical style and mysterious symbolic patterns. The markings covered nearly every accessible surface of the chamber, creating an intricate network of interconnected designs that seemed to flow from one wall to another. Some of the engravings appeared to be much older than others, showing different degrees of mineral staining and weathering that suggested they had been created over an extended period of time, possibly spanning many years or even decades. I photographed and measured hundreds of these cave wall markings, trying to identify any patterns or symbols that might provide clues about their meaning or origin. But just like the bone modifications, the cave engravings didn't match anything in my reference materials or databases. They weren't consistent with any known Native American petroglyphs from the region, nor did they resemble historical graffiti or modern vandalism. What made the cave markings even more unsettling was their apparent relationship to the specific location where David's remains had been positioned. The most elaborate and detailed engravings were concentrated directly above and around the area where his skeleton had been found, almost as if that particular spot had special significance in whatever system or ritual the markings represented. Back at the laboratory, I continued my analysis of David's remains while trying to make sense of the cave site findings. The more I studied the bone modifications under high magnification, the more convinced I became that they had been created using tools and techniques that were far beyond anything I had encountered in forensic contexts. The precision of the drill holes and the fineness of the engraved lines suggested the use of equipment that would be more appropriate in a medical laboratory or precision manufacturing facility than in a remote cave. I decided to consult with Dr. Robert Kim, a materials science expert at the University of Tennessee who specialized in tool mark analysis. Dr. Kim had worked on numerous forensic cases involving unusual tool marks and had access to sophisticated analytical equipment that could provide detailed information about how the bone modifications had been created. Dr. Kim's analysis revealed findings that were even more puzzling than my original observations. The drill holes in David's bones showed microscopic characteristics that were consistent with diamond-tipped precision drilling equipment, the kind used in advanced medical procedures or high-tech manufacturing. The engraved marking showed evidence of laser etching, a technique that requires expensive specialized equipment and considerable technical expertise. But perhaps most disturbing of all was Dr. Kim's assessment of when these modifications had been created. Using advanced scanning electron microscopy, he was able to examine the microscopic structure of the altered bone tissue in unprecedented detail. His findings contradicted everything we thought we knew about the timeline of David's case. According to Dr. Kim's analysis, the bone modification showed signs of having been created at least 10 to 15 years before David's disappearance in 2016. The microscopic aging patterns in the altered bone tissue, the degree of mineral infiltration into the modification sites, and the cellular response patterns all indicated that these changes had been present in David's skeleton for much longer than the 3 years he had been missing. This finding was medically and logically impossible. The bones were definitely David Thompson's, confirmed through multiple forms of identification, including DNA analysis, dental records, and unique skeletal features documented in his medical history. But the modifications to those bones appeared to predate his disappearance by more than a decade, which would mean they had been created while David was still alive and presumably unaware of their existence. I began to wonder if we were dealing with some kind of elaborate hoax or if there had been a mistake in the identification process. But repeated testing confirmed that these were indeed David's remains, and the cave site showed no evidence of tampering or staged placement that might indicate a hoax. Whatever had happened to David Thompson was genuine, but it defied every principle of forensic science and human biology that I had spent my career studying. The case took an even more disturbing turn when Detective Rodriguez contacted me with new information about David's background. Her investigation into his personal history had revealed details that cast his disappearance in a completely different light, and suggested that David's case might be connected to a pattern of similar disappearances that had been occurring in the region for decades. Detective Rodriguez had discovered that David wasn't just a casual wilderness photographer as his family had believed. Through her investigation into his personal effects and digital records, she found evidence that David had been actively researching unexplained disappearances in the Great Smoky Mountains region for at least 2 years before his own vanishing. His computer contained detailed files documenting cases going back to the 1970s, all involving experienced hikers and outdoor enthusiasts who had disappeared without a trace in remote areas of the mountains. What made David's research particularly significant was the level of detail he had compiled about each case. These weren't casual internet searches or newspaper clippings. David had conducted extensive interviews with family members, obtained copies of official investigation reports, and even visited many of the locations where people had last been seen. He had created detailed maps marking disappearance sites, compiled timelines of events, and identified patterns that law enforcement had apparently missed. Most disturbing of all, David's research files contained photographs and sketches of cave markings that were virtually identical to the ones I had found at his recovery site. These images had been taken at various locations throughout the Smokies, some dating back several years before David's disappearance. According to his notes, he had discovered these markings in at least 7 different cave systems across the region, always in chambers that were difficult to access and located far from established hiking trails. David's research suggested that the geometric symbols weren't random or isolated occurrences, but part of a larger system that spanned multiple locations across hundreds of square miles of wilderness. His notes indicated that he believed the markings were connected to the pattern of disappearances he had been investigating, though he hadn't yet determined the exact nature of that connection. Detective Rodriguez also discovered that David had been in contact with other researchers who were investigating similar phenomena in different parts of the country. His email correspondence revealed communications with individuals in Colorado, Montana, and the Pacific Northwest who claimed to have found comparable cave markings and unexplained skeletal remains in their respective regions. These communications suggested that whatever David had stumbled upon wasn't limited to the Smoky Mountains but might be part of a much larger and more widespread phenomenon. The more I learned about David's research, the more concerned I became about the implications for my own safety and that of my colleagues. If David had discovered something significant about these cave markings and disappearances, and if that discovery had somehow led to his death and the bizarre modifications to his remains, then continuing to investigate his case might put me at risk of suffering a similar fate. I decided to examine David's skeletal remains one final time, this time focusing specifically on any evidence that might relate to his research findings. Using the photographs and sketches from his files as reference, I began looking for connections between the symbols carved into his bones and the cave markings he had documented during his investigations. What I discovered during this final examination was perhaps the most unsettling finding of the entire case. The geometric patterns etched into David's bones weren't random or decorative as I had initially assumed. When compared to the cave markings in David's photographs, they formed a coherent symbolic language or code system. The bone modifications appeared to be a condensed version of the larger cave symbol network, almost like a summary or index of the information contained in the various cave sites. More specifically, the patterns on David's skull corresponded to markings he had photographed in a cave system near Cataract Falls. The modifications to his arm bones matched symbols from a site near Mount LeConte. The engravings on his leg bones were identical to markings he had documented in a cave system I had never heard of. Located in a restricted area of the park that wasn't accessible to regular visitors, it was as if someone had used David's skeleton as a map or catalog, permanently recording the locations and symbols from his research directly onto his bones. But the precision and extent of these modifications would have required intimate knowledge of David's research, access to his files and photographs, and sophisticated equipment to recreate the cave symbols in microscopic detail on bone tissue. The implications were terrifying. Either David had been under surveillance throughout his research period by someone who was documenting his every discovery, or he had encountered something in those caves that possessed knowledge of the entire symbol system and the ability to modify human skeletal remains in ways that defied medical understanding. I began experiencing strange incidents in my personal life that made me question whether I was also being watched or targeted because of my involvement in David's case. My home security system would trigger alerts in the middle of the night, but the cameras would show nothing unusual. I would find my research notes rearranged on my desk when I was certain I had left them in a different order. My computer would sometimes display files I hadn't opened, always related to David's case or cave archaeology. Most disturbing of all were the dreams I began having almost every night after examining David's remains. In these dreams, I would find myself in underground chambers filled with the geometric symbols, but the symbols would be moving and changing before my eyes, rearranging themselves into new patterns that seemed to carry meaning I couldn't quite grasp. I would wake up with the distinct feeling that someone or something had been trying to communicate with me through these dream sequences. The dreams became so vivid and frequent that I began documenting them in a journal, sketching the symbol arrangements I could remember upon waking. When I compared these sketches to David's research files, I discovered that many of the symbol combinations from my dreams matched patterns he had photographed in caves I had never visited or even heard of. It was as if the information from David's research was somehow being transmitted directly into my subconscious mind. Dr. Kim contacted me with additional findings from his analysis of the bone modifications that made the case even more inexplicable. His detailed examination had revealed microscopic traces of materials embedded in the drill holes and engraved lines that weren't consistent with any known earthly substances. The spectral analysis showed elemental compositions that didn't match anything in standard reference databases, suggesting that the tools used to create the modifications might have been made from materials that weren't naturally occurring on Earth. Furthermore, Dr. Kim had discovered that the bone tissue surrounding the modifications showed cellular structures that were unlike anything he had seen in normal human bone. The modified areas contained crystalline formations that appeared to have grown within the bone matrix, creating intricate geometric patterns at the cellular level that mirrored the larger symbolic engravings visible to the naked eye. These cellular modifications would have been impossible to create using any known medical or technological procedures. They appeared to be the result of some kind of biological process that could manipulate bone growth and cellular development in ways that were completely beyond current scientific understanding. The implications suggested that whoever or whatever had modified David's remains possessed knowledge of human biology and cellular manipulation that was far advanced beyond anything in our medical literature. I realized that I was dealing with something that fell completely outside the realm of conventional forensic science. The evidence from David's case suggested the existence of intelligence and technology that challenged my fundamental understanding of what was possible in our world. The precision of the modifications, the impossible timeline of their creation, the mysterious materials involved, and the apparent connection to a larger network of cave symbols across multiple states all pointed to something far more complex and disturbing than a simple missing person case. The weight of these discoveries began affecting my ability to function in my daily work at the body farm. I found myself questioning every case I examined, wondering if other remains might show similar impossible modifications that I had missed or dismissed as natural variations. I began spending excessive amounts of time examining routine skeletal remains under high magnification, looking for geometric patterns or unusual tool marks that might indicate similar interventions. My colleagues began to notice changes in my behavior and work patterns. I had always been methodical and thorough in my examinations, but now I was becoming obsessive, spending days on cases that should have taken hours. I was having difficulty sleeping, eating irregularly, and becoming increasingly isolated from my friends and family. The David Thompson case had consumed my life in ways that were affecting my mental and physical health. 3 months after completing my analysis of David's remains, I made the decision to resign from the body farm and leave forensic anthropology entirely. I couldn't continue working in a field where I had encountered evidence that challenged everything I thought I understood about human death, skeletal biology, and the natural world. The mysteries surrounding David's case had shaken my confidence in scientific methodology and rational explanation to a degree that made it impossible for me to continue practicing forensic science. But even after leaving the field, I couldn't escape the lingering questions and disturbing implications of what I had discovered. The geometric symbols, the impossible bone modifications, the mysterious materials, and the apparent connection to a larger pattern of disappearances continued to haunt my thoughts and dreams. I knew that somewhere in the remote caves of the Smoky Mountains and other wilderness areas across the country, there were answers to questions that challenged our understanding of reality itself. The case of David Michael Thompson remains officially unsolved, classified as a death by unknown causes in a remote wilderness location. But I know that the truth behind his disappearance and the modifications to his remains represents something far more significant and terrifying than a simple missing person case. David had discovered something in those caves that cost him his life and resulted in his remains being transformed into a permanent record of knowledge that we may never fully understand. I moved to a small town in Oregon where I now work as a high school biology teacher, far removed from the world of forensic science and unexplained skeletal modifications. But David Thompson's case continues to follow me in ways I never expected. About 6 months after my resignation, I received a package at my new address with no return label. Inside was a single photograph of cave markings identical to the ones I had found at David's recovery site. But this image was taken in what appeared to be a completely different cave system. On the back of the photograph, someone had written coordinates in David's handwriting, along with a brief message that simply said, "You understand now. They're watching." I never determined who sent that package or how they obtained my new address, but it served as a stark reminder that leaving the case behind didn't mean the case had left me behind. I still have nightmares about those geometric symbols, and sometimes I wake up with sketches in my handwriting that I don't remember drawing. The patterns are always different, but they maintain the same precise, methodical style that characterized the markings on David's bones. I've stopped trying to analyze or understand these unconscious drawings because I've learned that some knowledge comes with a price I'm not willing to pay. The most disturbing realization is that David Thompson was just one victim in what appears to be a much larger phenomenon that spans decades and multiple geographic regions. His research had uncovered the tip of something vast and incomprehensible, and his death serves as a warning about the dangers of digging too deeply into mysteries that were perhaps meant to remain hidden. To this day, I check my locks twice before bed and avoid camping or hiking in remote wilderness areas. I've learned that there are some cases in forensic science that can't be solved through conventional methods, and some discoveries that fundamentally change how you view the world around you. David Thompson's impossible skeleton taught me that reality contains layers of mystery that challenge everything we think we know about life, death, and what lies waiting in the darkness beneath our feet. The case file sits in storage somewhere, officially closed but never truly resolved. And somewhere in the remote caves of America's wilderness areas, those geometric symbols continue to mark locations where the impossible becomes terrifyingly real.